First reading a bill for an act to enable Australia to impose sanctions to promote compliance with international human rights law and respect for human rights, or to deter significant corruption and for related purposes.
And I call the member for Melbourne Ports.
Thank you very much, Speaker. I move that this bill be now read a second time.
The member for Melbourne Ports may proceed.
Speaker, if you're the general who sent the military hooligans to shoot down MH17, or you're the official in Khartoum who sends the Janjaweed militia to murder the Muslim people of Western Sudan, or if you're the Beijing official who has set up concentration camps for 1 million Uyghur people in East Kazakhstan, you will not like this bill. For too long, government officials and others connected with authoritarian governments and kleptocracies around the world have gotten away with the abuses of power without sanction, rubbing salt into the wounds of those they exploit, the ordinary law-abiding citizens of their countries. These abusers use their ill-gotten gains and status to travel abroad and bask in the affluence of the West, purchasing and investing in assets overseas, sending their children to expensive overseas private schools, hiding their ill-gotten gains in offshore bank accounts, and generally using such money offshore for the benefit of themselves, their families and their cronies. The aim of this bill, the International Human Rights and Corruption Magnitsky Sanctions Bill 2018, are threefold. First, to prevent proscribed foreign persons engaged in gross violations of human rights and corruption from visiting Australia and spending and investing their money here. It does this by enabling the Governor-General, on the advice of the Minister, to target these individuals with immigration, financial and trade sanctions. Second, by imposing sanctions on these individuals, they are exposed to the world and to the people of their countries as pariahs in the international community. And third, it is hoped that such sanctions and exposure will deter individuals in these authoritarian regimes from engaging in future gross human rights violations and corruption. As we know, sunlight can be one of the best disinfectants. Serge Magnitsky, whose name appears on the title of this bill, was a Russian lawyer who acted for Mr. Bill Browder in his Hermitage capital in Russia. Magnitsky discovered that some $230 million paid by Browder's company in taxes to the Russian government had been fraudulently misappropriated by officials working together with organised criminals. Magnitsky naively testified against these Russian officials. What happened then was an outrage. In testimony before the US House of Representatives, it was explained that Magnitsky thought that the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, was someone who was acting in the national interest, and if this $230 million theft of Russian people's money was exposed, the good guys would get the bad guys, and that would be the end of the story. Instead, Serge Magnitsky testified about these officials. The same officials arrested him, put him in pre-trial detention, tortured him in the most horrific way for 358 days, and he was killed in Russia in November 16, 2009. We thought the days of the Lubyanka were over in Stalin's time, but they weren't. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada have already responded to Russia's increasing international aggression with democratic legislation called the Magnitsky legislation. These laws link Russia and other authoritarian countries' corruption and human rights abuses with bars on entry, moving of funds and receiving family education. Partially as a response to Russia's insolent indifference to the murder of 228 million people and 38 Australians, I've moved this legislation. Let's remember, Mr Speaker, that the joint investigation team of which Australia participated reported that the Russians sent a Book 7 missile launcher from the 53rd Brigade of the Russian Federation Army across into disputed Ukraine. It then shot down the MH17. Both then and now, Russia and its leader Vladimir Putin have displayed a cruel indifference to their role in causing the tragic and unnecessary death of citizens from around the world, including the 38 Australians. And I speak today on their behalf. Australians are still outraged, Mr Putin, and the Duma of the Russian Federation should act to respond to this. The Magnitsky Acts are becoming around the world a weapon for democratic pushback by Western governments against officials connected with authoritarian governments who engage in serious human rights abuses and corruption in their own country. It's great to see all around the world democratic pushback, legislation by parliaments like ours in Canada, the United States and the United Kingdom. As the international lawyer Geoffrey Robertson argues, Magnitsky laws are national laws that allow governments to apply targeted sanctions on any individual involved in human rights violations, from senior officials to low-level officials, from judges to policemen and even non-government actors such as CEOs and contractors, as we know them in Russia, oligarchs. They take the form of asset freezes for funds held in banks and other financial institutions, as well as bans on visas for entering the country. It was a very interesting article of his in Australian Quarterly. The idea of pushing back on authoritarian regimes is best explained in testimony before the US Congress. Criminal justice is based on jurisdiction. One cannot prosecute someone in New York for a murder committed in Moscow. The murder of Sergei Magnitsky, for instance, was done under the cover of theft of the $230 million from the Russian Treasury. The money that was stolen wouldn't be kept in Russia. They easily stole it there, but they keep their ill-gotten gains in the West, where property rights and the rule of law exist. This led to the idea of freezing their assets and banning their visa travel to Western democratic countries. Following democratic pressure to extend the Magnitsky laws, the United States, for instance, passed the Global Magnitsky Act in 2016, called the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, in which this proposed bill of mine partially replicates, which deals with corrupt abuses of human rights and corruption all around the world, not just in Russia. In addition to the direct effects it has on individuals, the mere exposure or threat of exposure of corrupt human rights abuse is likely to have a significant deterrent effect on anyone contemplating such conduct around the world. For instance, the human rights activist and president of the World Uyghur Congress, my friend Rabia Kadir, in her statement before the US House of Representatives subcommittee said, if this Global Magnitsky Act becomes law, it will have a profound ripple effect, because merely listing some of the well-known human rights violators in authoritarian states like China will send a powerful message to low-ranking officials that their criminal actions will not be immune to international scrutiny, condemnation or consequences. For instance, and I think this is something that all of us all around the world are outraged, I, particularly with my background, find it incredible that in these days that 1 million Uyghur people could be sent to concentration camps. So the Xinjiang or East Kazakhstan Communist Party Viceroy Chen Guangzhou, with his monstrous plan to incarcerate 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, will not be forgotten by legislation like this if it is passed and a future federal government has a chance to name him. Just as the Christian people who are being persecuted in China at the moment, with their churches blown up and crosses blown off the roof also. The Global Magnitsky Act will protect fundamental human rights of the oppressed and save lives of people in Burma, Darfur, North Korea and Syria. The Global Magnitsky sanctions, according to Browder, will issue a stark warning to human rights abusers and kleptocrats around the world that no longer will they be able to commit atrocities with complete impunity. Targeted sanctions against those involved in corruption and human rights abuse will provide an immediate, tangible consequence which directly affects an individual where it hurts them the most, in the pocket. Leaders of corrupt regimes will know they are no longer able to protect their ill-gotten gains abroad or flee to their lavish properties in foreign countries. Totalitarian dictatorships ultimately fall, and when they do, the Global Magnitsky Act will prevent those who have committed human rights abuses from claiming asylum almost anywhere in the world. It's time that Australia joined this growing international movement and adopted its own Global Magnitsky law. The more countries that adopt such laws, the more jurisdictions that can potentially be made out of bounds to individuals involved in the shooting down of planes over Ukraine, or murdering journalists inside embassies, or interning and abusing millions of Uyghurs in concentration camps, expelling or killing Rohingyas, starving or incarcerating and torturing and executing the citizens, 300,000 of them in concentration camps in North Korea, or ethnic cleansing of people in places like Darfur, Rwanda or Srebrenica, and so on and so on. Vladimir Putin hates these laws, not so much because they could potentially target him directly, something that is probably unlikely given international relations, but because they could be used to target and expose his cronies and thus make them less amenable to doing his bidding. Geoffrey Robertson, in his fine article in Australian Quarterly, concluded by saying, if all advanced democracies adopted such laws and pooled information and targeted lists, the pleasures available to the cruel and corrupt would be considerably diminished. Mr. Speaker, I think democratic countries around the world need to be involved in more pushback against these authoritarian regimes. This is something that should attract support of both sides of politics. The great Australian actor Peter Finch in the film Network said, advised people in that film, go to the windows, open the windows and shout, "I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore." That should be the attitude that informs democratic citizens right across the world. I urge them to support this Magnitsky bill. People who want to speak to foreign spokesman Payne and Wong, who want to speak to Attorney General Porter and Dreyfus, they should do it. Email them.